This is Chris Arnzen, your host of Iron Sharpens Iron Radio, wishing you all a happy Wednesday on this 10th day of March 2021. And I am thrilled to have a first-time guest for the first hour addressing the theme, Standing Firm for Truth with Optimism in Dark Days. My first guest will be Senator Doug Mastriano of Pennsylvania's 33rd District. Senator Doug Mastriano is a combat veteran and son of a career U.S. Navy man who retired from the U.S. Army after 30 years of active duty as a colonel, a doctor of history with a Ph.D. and 4 master's degrees, author of Thunder in the Argonne, A New History of America's Greatest Battle, and Alvin York, a new biography of the hero of the Argonne, and co-editor of Pershing's Lieutenants, American Military Leadership in World War I, who has appeared on Tucker Carlson and numerous national radio programs. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you for the very first time ever to Iron Sharpens Iron Radio, Senator Doug Mastriano.
Chris, thank you for having me on, and I look forward to our conversation.
And let me give our listeners our email address right away if they have questions. Our email address is chrisarnzen@gmail.com, CHRISARNZEN@gmail.com. Please give us your first name at least, your city and state of residence, and your country of residence if you live outside the USA. And please only remain anonymous if your question involves a personal and private matter. Well, we have a tradition here on Iron Sharpens Iron Radio, Senator Mastriano. Whenever we have a first-time guest, we have that guest give a summary of their salvation testimony, including what kind of religious atmosphere you were raised in, if any, and what kind of providential circumstances our sovereign Lord raised up in your life that drew you to himself and saved you. So why don't we begin with that?
Yeah, not a particularly religious person as a youth. My mom was, fairly devout. My dad, not at all, and he was raised really as nothing in most of his life. Therefore, he really didn't have a preference. He'd show up at church for weddings and funerals, kind of thing. But in high school, a classmate invited me to his youth group, and I went. And for the first time in my life, I heard the gospel message. The bad news is you're a sinner and you're headed to hell. But the good news is Jesus can save you. So I went up to the altar 3 or 4 weeks in a row. Finally, the 4th week, the pastor's like, you only have to do it once. And I'm like, I want to make sure it sticks. It was kind of funny that they gave me, the Way Bible. Remember the Way Bible with the
yes.
That's back in 79. Gave me a copy of that, and I'm like, where do I start? And they're like, start with John, read to the end, and then go back to the front in the Old Testament. I was like, okay, and it was a pretty amazing change in my life. It was, the Lord came into my heart, and it was palpable. I could feel the change. I could feel hope and joy. I wasn't particularly, quote unquote, a bad kid growing up, but I was a lost soul, as you can imagine, and this really changed everything in my life. And so there was a lot of conflict that came from that, though, as you can imagine, not being in a strong Christian family household, and so my folks were a bit taken aback by the change in my life, and it was nothing but a positive thing. My athletics took off, my academics took off. I mean, everything was headed in the right direction, as you'd imagine. As a Christian, you do the best you can. And our youth group was kind of interesting. I know these days a lot of the youth programs are focused on fun and, social gatherings and have you, and there's a place for that. I'm not bashing that. But ours was more like, a church service for youth to relevant issues. And the youth pastor, he's preaching, whatever you do in word and deed, do it as unto the Lord, and right out of the scriptures. And he's like, so that means right now you're a student, or, if you need to be the best student you can be. It doesn't mean all A's, but it just means you do that to glorify God. And so really that's been sort of a driving force in a lot of my life. And that's you read off those accomplishments. That's a testimony to what God can do through a life.
Amen. And you have quite the illustrious career in the military. And I was planning on mentioning most of the, or at least a lot of the things that you have accomplished in the military. But if I had done that, we would be out of time before the actual interview started. But when in your life, and why and how in your life did an interest in joining the military enter into your mind to begin with?
Ever since I was 5 years old, I wanted to be in the Army. And
wow.
There was a lot of influence, obviously. My dad was a Navy man, and I remember one time at 4 or 5 years old, me and my brothers were out in the woods goofing off, and this helicopter came over our heads about 100 feet above us, and my dad opened up the door, and he's like waving at us. As a kid, you're like, that he's a giant, he's my hero. But the idea of being on board ship for me really didn't do much, and so a great influence in my life was my Uncle Joe Guba, and this tough Union Hungarian uncle of mine, and he was in Patton's Third Army. He was in the 4th Armored Division. So I just loved history, and I would sit at his feet and ask him questions. Normally, that generation didn't tell war stories, but you got this kid asking serious questions. Did you ever see a Tiger tank? And he's like, yeah, one of them almost killed me. And he'd tell me, the stories during the Battle of the Bulge when they're trying to relieve our guys trapped in Bastogne. He was one of the lead tanks. A Tiger tank took out his tank, killed the entire crew except him. He survived because his hatch was open. He was the driver, and it was kind of foggy, cold foggy, in mid-December, 44. And I'm like, so what happened? He's like, I went flying out of the tank. Part of my abdomen got caught on the hatch or something, and he said he woke up sitting Indian style in a puddle with his intestines floating in front of him. And I remember asking him, so what did you do? He's like, and his favorite comfort words were, you know what I mean? Kind of a deep voice like that. And he's like, you know what I mean? I just took my intestines and put them back in my stomach and went to the aid station. They patched me up, and I told them I'm going back to the front. They're like,
wow.
He just left. The doctors couldn't keep him, and he wanted to get back in the fight. That's America, huh? But his influence convinced me, yeah, I want to be in the Army like Uncle Joe. So I did the full 30 years active duty. I ended up as a strategic intelligence officer, and we cap out at Colonel. You can't go any further than that. And so about 7% of our class makes it to that. And that's just a testimony, of 1 Corinthians 1:27, God uses the foolish to confound the wise and the weak to confound the strong. And so he can do that with any life. And he gets the glory for all that.
Praise God. And you already mentioned that you were a history buff, or at least began to love history as a very young child. How did that begin in your life where it reached the point where you actually have earned a doctorate in the study of history?
So as a kid, one of my first books, when I was really serious, probably like 8 or 9 years old, was the Cactus Air Force, about the Marine Air Unit stationed on Guadalcanal. And it was a dark time in 42, 43 at Guadalcanal. The Japanese were constantly attacking the Marines on air, land, and sea, and it was a vicious battle. And then after that, I was turned on to Cornelius Ryan, who wrote A Bridge Too Far and The Longest Day, about D-Day, and, of course, Operation Market Garden. And these kind of stories with lots of vignettes of heroic people, but average people, but who rose up and did heroic deeds, really left an impression on me. So all my life, I just loved reading history. There used to be a series on that BBC had back in the 70s called The World at War. And they'd actually have the actual generals who fought in World War II, and they'd interview them and interspiced with the scenes, from the battlefields around the world in the Second World War. So that interest grew. Eventually, much later, I shifted more over to the First World War. And sadly, there's not a lot of historians in America, or many people in America that care about the First World War. But really, the First World War was the beginning of the Second World War. Into that, even the first Supreme Allied commander was not Eisenhower, it was General Foch in 1918. He said when the war ended, the matter isn't over, and in 20 years it's going to start again. And he's exactly right. 20 years later, it did start again.
Yeah, wow. How did God use your experiences in the military to mold you and shape you and make you a better man to prepare you to serve Him in a greater capacity?
Yeah, so it's unfortunate that a lot of people think that the military is, what they see in, Spielberg's interpretation of that, with Saving Private Ryan, where, every other word is, a cuss word. In some cases that might be true, but my experience going into the Army in the early 80s is a bit interesting. We had a new chief of staff, and the Army had just come out of a really rough period after Vietnam. And General Wickham, who was our chief of staff, he actually said, look, we need to be disciplined in word and deed. He went back to George Washington, who also tried to get his army to speak without profanity. And I remember when I was at airborne school in 1944 at Fort Benning, Georgia, somebody dropped the F-bomb in formation, and the instructors we had, they had black hats on with airborne wings on, so we called them black hats. And so when they heard the F-bomb, they ran over. You can't say fire truck. That's not allowed. I mean, it was just like, wow, this is my kind of army here.
Wow.
So whenever I was, at a unit in charge of men and women, I would ask them to try to be disciplined in word and deed, and try to sharpen their character muscle and strive for these ideals that the Army tells us to strive for. And the Army held up a lot of Christian models, even today, ironically, like Alvin York, the great hero of the First World War, who captured 132 Germans, but who entered the fight that day in 1918, 8 October, as a conscientious objector, and obviously he was ridiculed and mocked in his unit. He changed history, and strong Christian man. Where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain at Gettysburg, a little round top, who had a severe stuttering problem most of his life, and was transformed and blessed by God with the gift of becoming one of our greatest orators, and someone who was mocked and told never mouth anything, saving the United States of America on 2nd July 1863. So I would use these vignettes advocated by the Army, even today in our leadership manuals, as a way to say, look, these are the models that we're told to strive for, and this is how they made a difference by every day striving to do what is right and noble, and that made them brave and heroic in their hearts, and they built their character muscle, as I call that. And so when we see Alvin York and Colonel Chamberlain on the battlefield, that's merely an outward manifestation of the men they chose to become.
Yeah, you, speaking of Alvin York, it just reminded me of the Army medic Desmond Doss, who was a World War II medic, and I don't know if you saw the movie Hacksaw Ridge, but apparently it was a very true-to-life depiction of what he experienced in battle and the heroics that God used him to perform. Amazing heroics, bordering on the miraculous. Because at the end of the program, they had his actual comrades in arms who were still living, giving the testimony of what he had done for them. And he vowed not to ever carry a gun on the battlefield, but he insisted, in fact, on going into battle because he did not want to leave others to do this without the aid of a medic, and he turned out to be, after, just like Alvin York, after being mocked and even beaten up for being a coward and a weakling and a sissy, and on we could go, he turns out to be one of the greatest heroes of World War II.
That was moving at the end when actually his company commander, as an old man, was talking about him, and how he rushed a judgment on this guy here and thought he was a coward, and turns out he's the bravest man he ever met in his life, and the guy just started crying. Because you just see God chooses to use those that seem weak or foolish in the eyes of the world, because obviously then he gets the glory. And so, when we make his story our story, we can change history, and he did that through Doss, York, and Chamberlain.
Now, before I go into some of your role, your fairly new role as a senator, I wanted to ask you about some of your books here. Why did you choose to write about the Argonne? The specific title is Thunder in the Argonne, A New History of America's Greatest Battle. What were there things about that battle that were not yet recorded in a published work, or perhaps not on a popular reading level, or what have you? What was the catalyst that made you write about that specific battle?
So the first book was, of course, Alvin York, A New History of the Hero of the Argonne, and it won 4 book awards. I mean, it was just well received. And Alvin York is just one of over 1 million American soldiers that fought in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, America's largest ever battle, if I can say that. Campaign has many battles, but we won't get into rhetoric on that. And so I'm after how well the York book was received, I thought I needed to tell the rest of the story. And I wasn't particularly impressed or happy with many of there's like probably a dozen volumes out there that have been written across the years. Not a lot, actually, for something like this. That discusses the Muse-Argonne campaign, in a big picture. And so I'm like, well, let me contribute to the information on this here and tell the story in a understandable way, and also tell the story of the men, who fought there. And we put it together. I spent 100 days or so in the Argonne altogether in France. And it's bad when you're reading a history book on the Meuse-Argonne, and I'm getting lost. I have to pull out maps to try to figure out what they're talking about. And that was one of my frustrations. So my book is designed to make it easy for the reader to understand, but also dive deep as well and tell stories. And I put together the book, and I was just captivated by some of the stories there. There's a major from Missouri. His name was James Rieger, and they're mobilized for war in 1918. He ships over to France. His commander hates him because of his Christian faith, and tries to fire him. And James Rieger is running a very successful Sunday school program, trying to give the men something wholesome to do other than just getting in trouble downtown. And they're training in Texas at the time. And the Brigadier General Barry tried to fire him, but had no cause other than just not liking his faith. Thought it was making him weak and making the men weak. And so out of frustration, General Barry told Major Rieger, you'll never mount anything. You're altogether worthless and useless. Okay, fast forward about 6 months later, they're in the Argonne of France. They're part of the 35th Division. They're pressing the attack. Things aren't going so well. And Rieger goes on to liberate 3 French villages, does all these heroic deeds, gets the Distinguished Service Cross, is labeled by the French as the hero of the Argonne. And meanwhile, Barry is fired. General Barry is fired for, incompetence. He's the artillery commander by then, and he has his guns even firing at the Americans in the line. And so it's just the irony. So it's dark for James Rieger. It looks like his time in the army is going to be cut short. And thankfully it wasn't. Thankfully he had defenders out there, and in the end he ended up saving a lot of lives there and helping the Americans to continue to push north in the Argonne.
And your latest work that you co-edited, Pershing's Lieutenants, American Military Leadership in World War I. What was the inspiration for getting involved in that project?
So Major General Zabecki, I'll call him the lead editor. It was his book idea, and he's published probably about 17 books, all very serious historic books, very good writer, excellent writer. And he's like, hey, Doug, I've written so many books, and I've had this idea in my heart. I want to give it to you. And I'm like, hey, sir, can we, and even though we're both civilians, he's generals, I call him sir. I'm like, hey, sir, how about we both sign up for this here, because you have all the experience, then, I'll do a good chunk of the nug work, although he did a lot of the nug work as well. And he's like, okay. So we went through a list of topics, and the purpose of that book is to show how Pershing's leadership affected the generation of leaders then in combat, and then the next generation of leaders, which be the Second World War leaders like Patton, MacArthur, Marshall, and many others. And so we lay out, the good, the bad, and the ugly of Pershing's leadership style and how that affected the commands underneath him, and those that try to emulate him, and those that thought his style was, not so good. And it's a good book. It's good in a lot of ways, but mostly I would say because there's nothing like this on the First World War and a study of leadership.
Huh.
And I think somebody diving into that could look at it and say, yeah, I like this style and I don't like that style, and maybe help them improve in their own life.
Wow. Well, I know that all of these books are available on Amazon. Is there anywhere else that you want to recommend where our listeners can get a hold of them?
Yeah, Amazon's the best for those 3. Just type in Mastriano, and they even undersell, my author's discounts. I don't know how they do it. They must do bulk or something, but that's where you get a good deal.
Great. And you are, as I already announced in my introduction of you, you are a senator in Pennsylvania's 33rd District. First of all, what would be the responsibilities and roles of a senator?
So, obviously, in our General Assembly, the Senate and the House in Pennsylvania is bicameral and co-equal. So, we both have equal powers, but the difference is House reps There's 203 in Pennsylvania. They represent between 50 and 60,000 citizens in the state. State senator, there's 50 of us, and we have about 250,000. And so basically, I represent 250,000 people, and I'm to be their voice and to, metaphorically fight for the things that we value in this part of Pennsylvania. Now, my area is the 33rd district, and so it includes part of Franklin County, all of Adams County, part of your county, Cumberland, and part of York. And I like to tell people that are unfamiliar with the state, basically Shippensburg, Chambersburg, Gettysburg, and Hanover.
And were you surprised that you won? There are comparative few outspoken, very conservative, born-again believers that I am personally aware of anyway, in politics, and I know that you despise calling yourself a politician, but
thank you.
But there are many who call themselves Christian, but I have my doubts about many. I'm not going to mention them, obviously, but I have my doubts about even many conservatives in the Republican Party who identify themselves as Christian because of things that they wind up saying or doing that makes me scratch my head. But were you expecting to win your Senate race?
So I don't know if we have time to go through the odyssey. I'll go through it quickly. So I'm retiring from the Army November 2017, and I am just really broken up that I'm handing over the country to my son and his generation, less free, less secure, less prosperous than how I got it from my dad's generation. And I was really having a hard time with that, wrestling with the deployments, the sacrifices, the missed time with my family and all that. And as I was complaining about it, a young man basically said, well, Colonel, do something about it. And this was like a month before I retired. So, Rebbe and I are praying. And, of course, usually you get this sweet offer to stay in the federal service because you have a lot of credentials, you have a lot of experience. It's profitable and good for the federal government to retain people, like me, to keep doing strategy or whatever our expertise is. And, so sure enough, I had that offer come. But, the dilemma was, do you just ride off to the sunset like so many colonels and generals do, or do you try to do something to make a difference? You take the pay cut and put yourself in a line of fire and not kind of ride off quietly off to the west. And a few weeks after my retirement, the previous previous congressman announced his retirement, and it was a family seat. It's 47 years of him and his dad, and we ran. I knew I was going to win because we felt like we had a calling to do this. But I came in fourth of 8 candidates, and I'm kind of like, I didn't really struggle with this. I was kind of like, well, I don't know what that was about, God. So then applied for a bunch of other jobs, and looked like something was coming my way back in the federal government, doing stuff that I love. And the announcement for that job with the federal government was delayed by about a month. So I called, and I kind of winked and nodded. It sounded like I'd probably get it. It's the announcement come in a few days. Well, that night, I get a call from the previous senator saying he's resigning because just basically, he had it up to here with the politics. And he said, people love you. They know your name because you ran for Congress. Now you see God's perfect plan. And so we had a special election, a conferee, they call it. And usually, the quote-unquote establishment, usually they pick somebody. And so it's unusual to have an outsider to win a special election. And then I won my re-election, of course, in November. My wife and I, for the special election, so there's delegates that pick the person going to represent the Republican and Democrat parties. So we met with, I'd say, about 2/3 of the delegates, and they'd ask us questions. We'd tell them the honest truth. And after we got done meeting with people personally, we knew they were going to win the conferee in the first round, and that was a blessing from God.
I probably don't have to tell you, Senator Mastriano, that many of your fellow Christians and other conservatives are weighed down with pessimism due to the unexpected results from the recent presidential election. They believe the presidency was stolen. They doubt the next election will be free from fraud as well. Do you see any reasons, tangible ones, realistic ones, for optimism that we will have an honest election that we can trust in 4 years?
Well, one thing I do know is that if we don't get out and vote, then it's going to be, foregone conclusion that nothing's going to happen except continue a downward spiral. As far as last year, clearly I looked at every legal and constitutional way to try to get to the bottom of what happened in Pennsylvania. And I'll just focus on my own state. And, all we wanted was transparency. All we wanted was an audit. Just, and of course, because Governor Wolf liked the outcome, he told us with his Secretary of State, who since resigned in shame, that it was a perfect election and just basically, sit down, color, and shut up. And it's, no, why can't we have transparency, especially from a governor who promised to be the most transparent governor in Pennsylvania, which obviously that hasn't been the case, sadly. And that doesn't help things here. We need leadership in Pennsylvania that's going to represent all the people, not just the people in his party or narrow interest groups here. And that if there's an election and if there's concerns about the integrity of the vote, what's the harm in just opening the books? I mean, the governor has no problem throwing money around, so the excuse he had is going to cost a lot of money. It's just nonsense, because this is very important that people have trust in our election process. And if they don't, the Republic can't survive. On the other side here, yes, the House and Senate, we're trying to find ways to shore up the election. The thing was sabotaged. The idea of conservatives and some Republicans, these perfect Republicans, they look in the mirror and that's the only perfect Republican they see, that this is as a result of any failure of the House and Senate in Pennsylvania is just utter nonsense, because the election law was rewritten by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on 17th September. Facts are stubborn things. They changed the law as we voted on and passed. That's why we needed the U.S. Supreme Court to actually look at the case, which they didn't. And, of course, it was further undermined on the 23rd of October, Facts are Stubborn Things, by Secretary of State Bookbar. Wolf, Secretary of State, changed some of the safeguards as well, and then more changes were made the night before the election, at 10 o'clock at night. And so the House and Senate were trying to get our arms around what happened. House is doing fantastic hearings on trying to figure out what happened, what went wrong, what went right, and what do we need to do. I'm co-sponsoring legislation with Pat Stefano out of Somerset County. It's actually he's the lead on it, and to just undo this no excuse voting scheme that's been undermined by our court and of course the governor, and there's reforms as well by Senator Judy Ward that she's introducing. So yes, we have to get out and vote. Will corrections be made before the primary in May? No, because the hearings aren't going to be done until April or May. So, and the report will come out after that. But that's a primary, and that won't be corrupted. But more importantly, this May 18th, Pennsylvania, you get to decide if any future governor can have emergency powers that last beyond 21 days. And you can decide if Pennsylvania and the governor should be able to self-renew or has to get the authority from the House and Senate. So you have to get out and vote this May here and have your voices be heard. Otherwise, we'll have another COVID outbreak of some sort and live in this bondage as we are now.
Well, we have a listener that who has submitted a question. He is actually, or has been, a guest of mine here on Iron Sharpens Iron Radio a number of times, most recently to discuss a book that he co-authored with two doctors. One of them is my new general practitioner, Dr. Joel Yeager, in Newmanstown, Pennsylvania, of Heritage Family Health. I thank God for Ernie Springer, who is our questioner from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, because without providentially interviewing Ernie on this book that he co-authored with Dr. Yeager and Dr. Daniel O'Rourke, I never would have known of Dr. Yeager, and he actually got me off insulin and told me that I never should have been prescribed insulin to begin with. So that was quite a shock, and a pleasant shock, but still disturbing that I was prescribed this drug unnecessarily. But that's not the topic of our discussion today. Ernie Springer, co-author of The Coronavirus and the Leadership of the Christian Church, A Sacred Trust Broken, has a question for you. And he asks, would the senator please explain how his Christian faith governs his decisions and actions as he seeks to serve the people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
Wow, Ernie from Lancaster, love you, brother, and thanks for bringing Chris and I together. What a small world.
Yeah.
So it's obviously the left when they hear somebody's a Christian, they come at them. You need to, put your faith on a shelf. You need to leave it home. But notice they never have to leave their belief system behind. It's kind of ironic. The pushback comes against, whether it's, a Catholic Supreme Court justice going through the ringer, or just any Christian, running for public office here. Now, we're Americans, and you should be able to live your life as you see fit, as you want. Okay, so for the Christians, any worldview, but for the Christians, our worldview drives who we are. And so if you believe in the biblical concepts, that means you support the ideals of our founding fathers, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the right to life is probably is the most important issue of our generation. I know in a generation from now, they're going to look back and be appalled at the barbarity of America with 60-some million abortions since 74. The extremes we've gone, and how politicized it is, and how science-denying it is. And so it drives your ideals, so you fight metaphorically, for the right to life. You try to conduct your life with integrity and honor. You strive for those ideals that George Washington, upheld and Abraham Lincoln lived out. And so it's really at the core of everything you do. It should guide and direct any of your major decisions. And obviously, those decisions often come, through prayer and engagement with your constituents.
Yeah, I can vividly remember President Bill Clinton being interviewed by a young woman, college student on NBC, who identified herself as an evangelical Christian, and she asked President Clinton what role the Bible played in his life. And President Clinton said how much he loved the Bible, that the Bible is his favorite book, he reads the Bible every day, and on we could go with the high praises for the Bible that President Clinton gave. And he said, just because I believe in the Bible and love the Bible does not mean I have to have the Bible drive and determine my policies as president. I thought that was the most moronic and ridiculous answer to that question, because if you do love the Bible, you must believe it's true. So therefore, why wouldn't you want to have that as your source for decisions you make in the highest office in the free world? It doesn't make any sense.
That's a politician talking. That's another reason why I like to be called a politician, because that's icky. It's not honest. It plays both sides of the fence. It's not consistent. It's not logical. And so that's why I prefer to be called an elected official. It's not rhetoric or hyperbole or anything. I think there's a key distinction. Someone who's serving the people, or somebody who's serving themselves and will say whatever it takes to win a seat. If you believe in these concepts of our founding fathers, news alert, they got these ideas of all men are created equal from a Judeo-Christian faith, from Christianity, from the Bible. What other worldview has this? We take it for granted that our ideals have been exported around the world, thanks to the United States and other Western countries. This is stuff you can't talk about. Facts are, though, like in India, when the British, sadly colonized, there was a tradition that when a husband died, the wife had to throw herself on the fire. And these Christian ideals changed that. William Wilberforce saw the disgusting non-Christian-based approach of enslaving men and women and families from Africa. Evangelical Christian minister of Parliament in England, 17 and 1800, dedicated his life. Was led to the Lord, by the way, by John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, former slave ship captain. And he poured his heart and soul as an elected official to end slavery in the British Empire. And it took him 20-some years before he had his first legislative victory, and 40-some years to have a complete victory. That determination, that disgust and anguish about slavery was driven by his Christian faith. He knew it was inconsistent with biblical worldview and biblical values, and that's why he poured his heart into fighting it politically, and he changed history. So if you really do believe it, you're going to live by it. If you really don't, then it's otherwise just an interesting book.
Yeah, you were saying that the left can, with impunity, boast of their deeply held religious faith. We have Nancy Pelosi doing that on an ongoing basis. declaring that she is a faithful Roman Catholic. You have Raphael Warnock, who pastors the church formerly pastored by Martin Luther King Jr., currently a junior United States Senator from Georgia. Obviously, being unashamed about his cherished faith and using biblical allegories when speaking about problems in the United States, and might I add, I think twisting them in such a way that they are rendered heretical and blasphemous. But it's interesting how it is completely acceptable for them to declare their allegiance to their religion when they are on the left, and yet it is a pariah. It is considered a dangerous step towards a theocracy and religious tyranny when the right does the same. And even when we are speaking of those that claim their ideology comes purely from secular thought, isn't it not true when you passionately believe in things that do have religious ramifications, and when you believe in them religiously and you're devoted to them, for instance, whenever you believe something is right and good and celebratory, like murdering unborn children, like the attempts of changing one's gender, even though we know that cannot really happen, and things like that, you are taking a religious position, whether you declare that or not, because you are saying God is a liar. You're saying the Word of God is a liar, or is the Word of God is false, and it's not really the Word of God at all. So isn't this rhetoric and the ideology that we hear from the left, can we not accurately label it as religion, and that they really have no business saying that we can't mix or should not mix politics and religion when they are in reality doing that very thing, even if they refuse to call it religion?
I am sickened and disgusted by the double standard and the inconsistency of the left and the media. And you're absolutely right. They hold one measure for people they like ideologically and completely opposite. And the ironic and sad and pathetic and disgusting thing to me is they can't even see they have a cognitive bias and sometimes a confirmation bias that just can't even see that they're being inconsistent. You know, they'll celebrate, Buttigieg, did a couple of years in the reserve as almost like some kind of great war hero. But then you have a 30-year veteran like me, and I'm like villainized. It's like, what? And so if you're going to go in the public office, don't expect the praise and laud. In fact, expect, as I have had and continue to have against me, outright lies perpetuated by the media, outright lies perpetuated by the Democrat Party, vicious, malicious attacks, and they just keep repeating these things over and over, hoping they'll get traction. But it's based off of lies. So you're not going to be popular. The media is not going to laud your praise unless, you vote their way, and then they'll temporarily, wrench you until they can buy a Democrat. We have had terrible tragedy in Pennsylvania this past year, and the drama in New York, we have the same here in Pennsylvania. Cuomo actually, in a lot of ways, it looked like Wolf mimicked and followed Cuomo's lead. But in the case of sending the science-denying, ridiculous policy of taking COVID positives from a hospital and sending them back to elder care facilities, that was actually a wolf led by a week. That policy came into effect 18 March, so almost a year ago, and unleashed the plague. Over 12,200 of our loved ones dead as a result of that failed policy. And the media, if they were honest and decent people, generally, I know there's good ones out there, but overwhelmingly, where were they? Did they do stories? Did they show Levine as somebody incompetent who had policies that were destructive? That they showed Levine as a sort of villain who knew the danger and risk that Levine created and saved Levine's own mom from the elder care facility and dropped mom off into a hotel and didn't come out like a decent human being and say, hey, Pennsylvania, save your loved ones, save them. We got a problem. We made some mistakes. But instead of doing investigative journalism, turning over every rock, which would have saved lives, by the way, it would have mattered because this policy was still in effect as late as November, as far as I heard. They lauded and praised Levine as a steady hand, in the crisis in Pennsylvania, and Levine got a promotion for it. Convince me that if this was a Republican governor that there would be this much love and praise for destructive policies that materially and factually killed 12,200 people. It's completely be different. We had rally on the steps of Harrisburg in September. I'm going to call it a rally, a gathering to honor those who, died as a result of this failed policy. And it was mostly family members there. And nobody from the media showed up. They didn't care. If it was a Republican governor, though, you can imagine every camera would have been there. They would have had microphones in the faces of loved ones. It would have been breathless reporting of the catastrophe and the sorrow and sadness. So we can't. It's frustrating. I got a reporter, that's been looking under every rock over the past month or two. I don't know who's paying this guy here. I don't know how he has so much time. And eventually stories are going to come out just full of lies and deceit. When you see this kind of stuff, about a Republican you like or trust, you just ask yourself, is that the Doug Mastriano I know? And who is this reporter? Did he do any reports on Levine or Wolf last year when it really mattered during COVID and these heavy-handed shutdown policies that were just science denying? It's all about control. And so this is the thing that drives me crazy. We can't grow weary doing good. It is frustrating. I do agree we have to call it out. We have to point it out so we can educate the next generation and maybe get some journalists to actually, they'll see that they need to be consistent. Because otherwise, when we do have a Republican governor in 2 years, why should we take them seriously when they're asking questions? And I take that First Amendment more serious than they do because I've actually served, the country most of my adult life in uniform to defend that right to free press. And it is essential to our republic that we have a press that cares enough to, hold powerful figures accountable on both sides of the aisle, not just work for one side.
Well, Senator Mastriano, if you could in a minute summarize what you most want etched in the hearts and minds of our listeners today before you leave the program, and I hope the next time you come back on the program, God willing, that you stay with us for 2 hours. But if you could, just summarize what you most want our audience to remember today.
Just remember who we are. Remember, in Joshua chapter 4, when the children of Israel crossed over the promised land, the Jordan River, when God dried it up. And he said, each tribe take a stone and pile on the other side, on the Israeli side. So when you and your children pass by, you'll remember what the Lord your God did for you. So remember, Pennsylvania, that we were founded by William Penn, a Quaker in England who was tossed in jail for his Christian faith several times. And he wanted this, and he prophesied that Pennsylvania would be a seed of the nation, a holy experiment. And a generation after his passing, that happened. In 1776, the light of liberty was lit in Philadelphia. And it changed everything. We take this for granted. But the light of liberty, anywhere there's freedom, goes back to then, from a political perspective. And then, of course, it's always unfinished business. 1863, new birth of freedom in my district at Gettysburg. And then 2001, Todd Beamer, Flight 93 on 9/11. Terrorists took over his plane headed for the U.S. Capitol. And him and other heroes rose up and said, let's roll. So let's remember those who went before us here. Let's not grow weary doing good. If we face much darker times, let's stick together, be active, find candidates that you believe in and support, get behind them. And if you're not satisfied, then maybe you should run for office yourself. But just don't stand aside. Be involved. This republic needs you. As Benjamin Franklin was leaving Constitution Hall in the 1780s during the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by Mrs. Powell, do we have a monarchy or a republic? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. Will you keep it? It's up to us now.
Amen. Thank you so much for being such an excellent guest, Senator Mastriano, and I look forward to your return to Iron Sharpens Iron Radio.
Thank you. God bless you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.